Hi everyone, thanks for joining me. So, things are weird at the moment. I mean, more or less the whole world is ground to a halt, except for low skilled workers who are thankfully using their low skills to keep the world safe and healthy and fed. Huh, maybe we need to rethink that term. Sports are postponed or cancelled, shops, theatres, museums, libraries, they're all closed. And all this is obviously happening because all the governments worldwide have colluded to create independent surveillance states in order to progress their harmful lefty or righty agendas. Whichever one makes you more angry, I don't really care. And it's funny, all this talk of mass government surveillance, it reminds me of a book which very few people ever actually mention. I think it was called 1994. And it was about how surveillance at the University of Oslo was increased after someone stole the Edvard Munch painting The Scream, which obviously happened in 1994, hence the name of the book. At least I think that's what it's about. I've never actually read it. Just like everyone else who mentions it online. Now there are some people, these experts, so-called experts, who are saying that all this is happening because a new strain of coronavirus has been discovered, and it's actually spread throughout the globe, leading the World Health Organization to declare a global pandemic. And hearing myself say that out loud, it does actually make more sense. So, as the beginning of every email you receive now says, we are living in uncertain times. So I wanted to take this opportunity to look at certain people who might want to take advantage of this uncertainty to further their own agendas. Now, I had originally planned to talk about 2 or 3 specific people in this video, but as you can tell by the length of the video and the title of the video, things got a little out of hand when I was researching one of them. So we're only going to be focusing on one person today, and that person is obviously John Waters. And what you'll be hearing a lot of is very familiar rhetoric, and that rhetoric being a kind of faux oppression, which is what a lot of, I'll say, people on the right tend to do these days. The main way to get attention is to essentially make up a freedom, claim that freedom is being denied, and then scream that you're being oppressed. So as I said, the video you're watching now is about John Waters. The second part, I suppose, of this trilogy of videos I was planning on doing would be about Gemma O'Doherty. And then the final part will be essentially what they've both been doing since the COVID outbreak, so I'm sure you've seen that in the papers, and if you haven't, then you can look forward to my third video and I'll tell you all about it. So I am hoping that this video and the next one, if I ever actually gather up the mental strength to do it, will provide some context to what's going on, to who these people are, and kind of answer the important questions that you might have, like, who are they? What have they done? Why are they continuing to do things? And oh Lord, won't you please make them stop? And look, I know things are shit at the moment. I understand that. I'm in the same boat as most of you. I'm not going to say all because that would be presumptuous. Some people decide to do a conga, but ignore them. And I understand that you will be frustrated and angry and under a lot of mental strain. I mean, it's going to be difficult, but it's important that we don't let people like this use this opportunity as a weapon. Anyway, let's get cracking. Who is John Waters? Well, he was previously a columnist for Hot Press and the Sunday Tribune. He was also a feature writer for The Independent, The Sunday Independent, and The Irish Times, which he left in March of 2014, saying there was, quote, no place anymore for divergent views like mine, end quote. He'd also previously been the editor for the magazines McGill and In Dublin. He was also a reporter for the television show Arts Express on RTE, which is Ireland's national broadcaster. Currently he's a writer for the American religious journal First Things. He's published 10 books and written 4 plays, 2 of which were radio plays, and one actually won an award. He's a man who has an impressive writing history behind him. He's clearly a good writer. I mean, I don't think you can fluke your way through an entire play and have it be award-winning. So why am I even talking about him? You'd assume that somebody who's written for some of the biggest publications in Ireland would be somebody who really thinks out their points and understands the ever-evolving landscape of the world and Ireland and really has their finger on the pulse, but he does not. Originally, I thought I'd prove that by pointing to an article that John wrote years ago about mobile phone use. He said that mobile phones would damage interpersonal relationships and make dating more difficult, all that kind of stuff. But that's not the point I was going to be looking at. At the very start of the article, he actually calls himself a Luddite. And I thought, well, that kind of makes my point for me. But I decided against that because I thought it was too obvious. And it could have been tongue-in-cheek. I mean, Lord knows I always say that I'm an old man. I don't mean it. I'm just exaggerating for effect. I decided in the end to simply continue on with the video, he says as he makes a point explaining what he's actually saying. As we go through the video, you'll see the numerous different topics that John has opposed. He's taken a certain stance on things. And in all the topics we're going to be talking about today, he was on, I guess what you could call, the wrong side. John's viewpoint on these topics was crushed by the electorate. He does not have his finger on the pulse of the Irish people. If anything, it's the opposite. It won't be a surprise for you to hear that John is a deeply religious man. He's currently a writer for the religious journal First Things, as I mentioned earlier on, which isn't really a problem. I mean, religious man writes for a religious journal, it's not headline news. No, the issue here lies in the very questionable points of view and the very questionable content that First Things puts out. And I don't want to say that John agrees with everything that's being written, but some of the stuff that they put out is pretty gross. First Things describes itself as America's most influential journal of religion and public life, and I really, really hope that that's not actually true. Because if it is, religious people in America need to take a good long look at themselves. Do you remember a few years ago when those audio recordings of Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon came out? This was when Nixon was president. No? You must remember. The one where Reagan described black people as, quote, monkeys from African countries who are still uncomfortable wearing shoes, end quote. No? Okay. Well, I've popped a link in the description below so you can have a read through the Atlantic article about it. It's pretty extraordinary. Students at the King's College in New York live in houses named after historical figures. One of these houses is named after Ronald Reagan. After this audio surfaced, understandably, they didn't really feel comfortable with having a house named after him, and they decided they might want to change it. Now, First Things had a few things to say about that. And originally I was going to summarise the points that they make in this article, but their thoughts on the situation are genuinely so wrong that I couldn't do it justice. So I'm actually just going to read a few paragraphs here, which, I'm not going to lie, shocked me. I'm also going to put a link in the description so you can see that I'm not actually taking these paragraphs out of context of the wider piece. Quote, "We should be wary of a selective moral perfectionism. Should the standards now being applied to Reagan also be applied to John F. Kennedy, sexual assault, Lyndon B. Johnson, blatant racism, or Martin Luther King Jr., plagiarism, infidelity, possibly sexual assault? In a word, no. The King's College should not rename the Reagan House, just as we should not rename every MLK Boulevard." End quote. It is interesting that they mention more of MLK's crimes. Well, I say crimes. And I know there's a lot of discussion at the moment still about whether he plagiarized essays when he was a student, but it's pretty well known that the other accusations that they mention actually came from the FBI as a way to denigrate him. I wonder what it is about Martin Luther King that made First Things point him out more than the others. Maybe we'll never know. Quote and subquote. "We recognize, grieve, and repent of the myriad ways our words and actions, both intentional and unintentional, have served to denigrate, dehumanize, and marginalize members of our community." End subquote. This line is from a theological commitment to diversity the college adapted in spring 2019. Remember when evangelical Christians talked about their commitment to Christ? This statement concludes by affirming the college's commitment to building a Christ-centered community that celebrates ethnic and cultural differences. What is missing from this official response is any reference to the gospel, the evangel. A properly evangelical response would start with what Jesus said about forgiveness, then they read a long Bible quote, which I don't think we need to read. It would end with the New Testament view of Christian unity. Subquote, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." End subquote and quote. Because that's certainly how things have worked in the past, and continue to work now. I also want to point out the whole "there is neither male nor female" section as well. That's surely going to trigger some right-wing folk. They're going to be tweeting at Jesus that he should identify as an attack helicopter, as they do all the time. Okay. Quote, "Unfortunately, the King's College seems to be following the same pattern as secular colleges across America. Disgruntled minority students complain about diversity and inclusion, and administrators spring into action with solutions that satisfy no one. Christian colleges and universities should be better equipped than secular institutions to respond to the challenges of race. Christians should counter the demands of identity politics and its celebration of division. But the college's adoption of the theological commitment to diversity has placed it in an untenable position where there is only one solution: cave to the voices of the loudest and most strident activists." End quote. Jesus Christ. I mean, that's your argument? That's your reasoning for not wanting to change the name? Like, damn those complaining minorities? That's such an awful take on the situation. You mentioned forgive and forget. I mean, it's amazing that you can forgive someone for being horrendously racist as long as it owns them libs, I suppose. It's good to know. And the whole idea, the whole way that they look at this argument, takes on another level of awfulness when you realise that one of the houses at King's College is named after Sojourner Truth. Like, it's such an extraordinarily out-of-touch way of looking at the world. But anyway, I want to remind you, having said all that John Waters left the Irish Times because he said that there was, quote, "no place anymore for divergent views like mine," end quote. It's rather interesting then that he'd continued to write for a journal which seems to care very little for the legitimate complaints of minorities about racism, and seems to support the idea that racism isn't actually an issue at all. But John is still writing for them, so I do hope that having divergent views from the overall publication isn't the problem for him anymore. It doesn't seem to be. What does confuse me about this, though, is that John has said that he left the Irish Times because of his divergent views, but he's also said that he left the Irish Times because of internet trolls, like people who would come onto his articles and comment saying that he was wrong or insult him, which of course never happens on the internet, so I don't know where he got that idea from. Quote, "These are not readers, these are freeloaders who come in. My readers are the people who come into the shop and bought the newspaper, and they would sometimes write a very critical letter about me to the Irish Times, and that's fine. But these are people who just got out of bed, scratch their arses, go to their keyboard, and just rant." End quote. Okay, well, the first thing to say is people commenting on those articles online, that is free speech. It's never nice speech, let's be honest. Comment sections, they're a bit of a cesspit. But you don't get to be the gatekeeper of how people decide to exercise that right. But anyway, let's work this whole situation out because it has been frying my brain. So John left the Irish Times because he would write articles and people would complain about them in the comment section, and he didn't like that. But he also left because he said that the Irish Times was not a place where he was able to write the articles he wanted to because his views weren't tolerated anymore, even though he actually did write those articles because people were able to comment on them, and that made John upset. Clear as mud. What John is actually doing here is playing the victim card. He's trying to make it seem like he was subtly pushed out of the Irish Times. And this is a classic defense from, let's be honest, people on the right. The victim, said very sarcastically, is never in the wrong in these situations. The worst that they could be accused of is being too honest. And the powers that be, the liberal elite or whoever it is, don't like that. I mean, it seems to me that he just didn't like the viewpoints of the other writers, and he kind of had a strop. Now, I could be wrong, that's my view on the situation. So take that with a grain of salt. And I really emphasise that that's my view because we are going to be hearing a lot of arguments made by Waters supporting his viewpoints in this video, and I am going to be giving my opinion on his viewpoints, using the words he's spoken and written as my platform for basing those opinions. And I do truly believe everything that I am going to say in this video, and if I am wrong or mistaken, then I will hold my hands up and apologise, but I don't think I am. It's also very important to note that when you hear all the arguments that Water makes later on, he has never been wrong about anything. Oh, how'd that last one sneak in there? Alright. And finally, before we move on to the real meat of this video, I want to point out that I am not going to be judging John Waters here. I am simply outlining things that he has said, when he said them, and giving a context. Ireland's take on, let's be honest, anything other than heterosexuality was always touchy, to say the least. People would always say they'd no problem with gay people, but it was always in the context of not in my backyard. Anti-discrimination laws, which basically only amounted to making hate crimes illegal, were introduced in 1989. Homosexuality was only legalised in 1993. That's just a simple act of being gay. Not marriage, nothing like that. By 1993, gay people were legally allowed to exist in Ireland. Hooray! Good job, guys. We did it. In 1998, anti-discrimination laws in places of employment were brought into effect, meaning that you couldn't discriminate against someone in the workplace because of their sexuality or have that be a reason for their firing. Fair enough. Good, as it should be. Then in the year 2000, lesbians were allowed to undergo IVF treatment, and then basically nothing. People were gay, they were supported and accepted more and more, but there was nothing else in terms of rights. 10 years later, civil partnership was brought into Ireland. And up until this point, civil partnership didn't exist at all. It's a common misconception that this act was passed specifically for same-sex couples, but it was actually for anyone. But even so, people still complained, saying the gays would get something closer to equality, and we couldn't have that, could we? Cardinal Sean Brady, who incidentally covered up the sexual abuse of minors in the Catholic Church, and who I once regrettably had to shake hands with at my graduation ceremony, he said that the Civil Partnership Bill was, quote, an alarming attack on the fundamental principle of freedom of religion and conscience, and that the Irish people must choose between a culture of death or a culture of life, end quote. So after this, there was still some activism, there was still a push towards actual equality for same-sex couples, but there was no real action until the marriage referendum. So having said that, let's talk about the marriage referendum, and there is a lot to talk about behind this, like an awful lot. And that's not really what this video is about, so I'm going to try give a very brief Spark Notes version of what led up to the announcement of the referendum itself. And I say very brief Spark Notes version, but look at how long this video is. You're probably going to be sitting there for about 8 years, but even so. So if you don't know who Lydia Foy is, you probably should. I'm probably going to do a video about her in the future because it's just an incredible story. So do let me know if you'd be interested in hearing about that. Lydia Foy is a trans woman who transitioned in the early 90s, and she got her details corrected on basically every document that she owned, apart from her birth cert. So the question eventually got raised, if Lydia wanted to marry a man, could she? I mean, she's a woman, and he'd be a man, so based on the law at the time, have fun, work away, get married. But no. Because Lydia was still seen as a biological man. Therefore, if she were to marry a man, it would be seen as same-sex marriage, which was not legal. Lydia's cases kept getting rejected, and she ended up in court 3 times, eventually finding her way to the Supreme Court of Ireland. Now, a few years prior to this, in the UK, another trans woman, Christine Goodwin, had sued the UK government for essentially non-recognition of her transition. And Christine, having gone to the European Court of Human Rights, it was decided that the UK was in breach of Articles 8 and Article 12 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which are right to respect and private and family life, and the right to marry and to found a family. This, in turn, led to the Gender Recognition Act in the UK. But this was in 2004. Lydia Foy actually used this decision as the basis for her argument to the Supreme Court. There's a precedent now that can be used. And the Supreme Court eventually made basically the very same judgment that the European Court of Human Rights had made in Christine's case. In 2007, they said that the Irish government and the laws of the country were not in line with what are now classed as basic human rights, and that there should be no question or issue with amending the laws to facilitate this. Pretty open and shut. Done. But the Irish government actually opposed and challenged this decision all the way up until 2010, when they set up a committee to look at both the official recognition of transgender rights and the question about same-sex marriage. The committee came to a decision in July 2011, which was basically let people get married and let transgender people be who they actually are. The government then decided to set up a constitutional convention in December 2012, which was unprecedented, coming to the decision that gay people should have the same rights that everyone else has, and they came to that decision in July 2013. So the Taoiseach responded to say that there would be a referendum no later than mid-2015. Now, that is obviously great news, and it's fantastic to hear, and it's good that something was actually done about it, but there is plenty which can be said about the fact that 2 consecutive Irish governments refused to make a decision on same-sex marriage, in effect delaying any action being taken for about 8 years, then ultimately deciding that they would rather amend the constitution as opposed to just tabling an act in the government, therefore taking the decision out of their own hands anyway, because amending the constitution would have to be voted for by the people in a referendum. But I suppose that's probably for another video as well. Now you're probably wondering why I'm even talking about this. Where has John gone, I hear you ask? I haven't heard about him in a while, I hear you say. I really wish I could say that more often. I really do. Well, I can assure you, I might kind of know what I'm doing here, so just hold tight. It'll all come together. So in Ireland, we'd essentially gone 22 years where it was legal to be gay, but that was basically all. I mean, individuals and businesses couldn't discriminate against you, and you and your partner could basically decide to not marry each other legally, but you didn't have the same rights as a heterosexual couple. You are a member of society, but you are, in a sense, a gay member of society. And then in 2011, after we had the baby step of allowing civil partnerships on the island, things took off quickly. In 2015, we had the same-sex marriage referendum, which passed. You had the right to legally change your gender. There was an expansion of the anti-discrimination laws, which were originally enacted in 1998, to include schools and hospitals which were run by the religious order. In 2016, same-sex couples were allowed to adopt stepchildren. In 2017, joint adoption by same-sex couples was allowed. In 2019, automatic parenthood on the birth certificates for children of same-sex couples was allowed. The rate of change was genuinely absolutely stunning, and I must admit, even took me by surprise. I used to be extremely cynical about Ireland and the place of equality in Ireland, but the marriage referendum changed pretty much all of that for me. I mean, I thought it was going to be very close, and I remember discussing possible outcomes with a friend of mine, and I was wondering what would happen when more people voted no. I genuinely thought if it were to pass, it would be max 1, 2, maybe 3%. I thought Ireland was still too old school, and I was wrong. And I'm very happy I was wrong. Also, by the way, do you know who else was wrong about the marriage referendum? John Waters. Waters was an active member of the no side of the campaign. By the way, for those who don't know, in a constitutional referendum in Ireland, you always only either vote yes or no. Yes for, yes, I would like the constitution to be changed for whatever amendment is being tabled, or no, I would not like the constitution to be changed. You will be hearing the terms yes side and no side quite a few times in this video, so I thought it was important to point that out. Now, John claims the only reason he was an active member of the no side was not because he was against gay marriage, no, but because a yes vote would so drastically alter the constitution that it would make the rights of biological parents null and void. He said that people weren't looking at the nitty-gritty details, or looking at the hard cases. At least I think that's what he was trying to say. I'm not entirely sure what he meant, probably because he basically made it all up. I mean, here's a clip of him talking on the Irish radio station News Talk 106.
Okay, so in a practical sense, What are your concerns? What are you worried might happen?
Well, one of the reasons we call ourselves First Family First is we're focusing on the first family. If you get married for the first time and you have children, now we have divorce for the last 20 years, but it was never intended when divorce came in that when you separated from your spouse, that you would be free to, or that you would be compelled to, as it were, divorce your children as well. And one of the concerns we have is that a combination of instruments, including this amendment and the recently passed Children and Family Relationships Bill, will cause that first relationship to be more or less null and void in terms of parenthood.
Now, I'm sure you won't be surprised to know that this just isn't true at all. There wasn't going to be any wording changes to the existing article on the Constitution. Article 41 had 7 subsections broken into 3 parts, which you can see on screen now. The only change which would have been made would be additional wording being added. Part 3 of the article would have had a 4th subsection, which would read, quote, "Marriage may be contracted in accordance with the law by 2 persons without distinction as to their sex," end quote. Now, if John Waters was mistaken about this, and he thought that there would be a complete overhaul of Article 41, but he had no issue with same-sex marriage, as he says, why wouldn't he just come out and say that it's a disgrace that we even need to vote on this in the first place? Why not campaign to keep the Constitution as it is and have legislation of same-sex marriage recognised by the state, as opposed to within the Constitution? I guess a kind of yes but campaign, if you want to put it that way. I mean, there was nothing really in the wording which could be read as not recognising same-sex couples as it stood prior to the referendum. That is, unless you were of a certain mindset. That mindset being that you would look at 3.1 and view the term the family as heterosexual only, because same-sex couples can't procreate, which is a common argument against same-sex marriage, and also one of the arguments used in the Great Replacement or white genocide conspiracy theories. The rights of straight white people are being attacked by everyone and are going to be taken away. Now again, Waters is very clear that he does not have any issue with same-sex couples, although he did say that 2 gay men adopting a child is the same as 2 brothers adopting a child, which, it's not.
What I'm referring to there is the absurdity of the idea that if 2 brothers who love each other in a particular way decide, we would like to adopt a child, this society would regard that as an absurdity. They would laugh them out of court. Yet, if 2 men who are involved in a sexual relationship go forward to adopt a child, we're told now that should be okay. Now, I find that really hard to understand, intellectually. Why is it that it's okay, but it's not okay for two brothers or 2 straight men? That's merely the point I'm making there. And I think that's a legitimate point.
Now notice here how he delegitimizes the relationship between the 2 men. They aren't in a relationship. They aren't a couple. They're in a sexual relationship. And this is just my personal interpretation of the term, but whenever I hear that people are in a sexual relationship, it normally has negative connotations. There's normally something dark or seedy about it. It's almost like a form of deviancy. And, of course,
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
I also absolutely love how he finished that statement with, "I think that's a legitimate point." Like somebody finishing up a spider diagram for a piece of fiction they want to write and going, yes, those are pretty good ideas I just threw out off the top of my head. Anyway, in the same interview he goes on to say that gay marriage is satire.
So there's something fundamentally wrong. So to go off then and come up with a peripheral issue, which gay marriage is in my view, and to deal with that first, before dealing with the raw core, the bloody core of our family law and our family life in this country, that is satire. That is satire. It is a mockery of reality to actually deal with something so peripheral and so marginal when there is such a wound at the heart of our culture, of our family life and of our intimate life in this culture. So I make no apologies for calling it a satire. It is satirical.
Now all of these quotes come from an interview with The Independent that was published in April of 2014. Now again, that was published in April. It could have taken place beforehand, the article doesn't actually specify, but it was around then. A few months prior to this, in January 2014, Rory O'Neill, probably better known as Panty Bliss, appeared on a talk show on RTE hosted by Brendan O'Connor, and allegedly called 3 separate parties homophobic. Those parties were John Waters, the Iona Institute, which is an extremely Catholic right-wing lobbying group here in Ireland, and Breda O'Brien, who is another Irish Times writer and a member of the Iona Institute. The main question I have to ask is, was this actually said during the interview? Did Rory really call these people/groups homophobes? And look, this has been written about a million times over, so I'm not going to dwell on it too long. There are far more informed and intelligent people who've written about it. I'd actually highly recommend the illustrated history done by Chrissy Curtin in Medium from 2014. It's really beautiful and gives a great outline and history of the whole saga. I've popped a link to that in the description below. Hi everyone, so I'm recording this after I've actually gone through and edited the whole video, and I've been told that I actually can't include the quotes or the transcript from the interview between Rory O'Neill and Brendan O'Connor. Honestly, it's not super important to hear the exact words. I suppose the main points that I need to make are the fact that Rory O'Neill described homophobia by saying that it isn't necessarily evidenced by someone being a monstrous person all the time. It's about recognizing the internal biases that one might have, and then either using those biases to push an anti-LGBT agenda, or simply refusing to recognize that you have them, where they come from, and that they will have a negative impact on other people's lives. The other really important thing that I want to point out is that Rory O'Neill, as far as I'm concerned, does not actually call any of the 3 parties homophobic. But clearly people think otherwise. So, Waters wrote a piece in Village magazine titled, "So Who's the Illiberal Here?", which was published on April 23rd, 2014. That's a great title, by the way, John. The answer is probably you. And this article was all about the fallout, as he sees it, from the Pantygate incident, as it came to be known. The funny thing is, John actually mentions this article numerous times in interviews on both TV and radio, saying that nobody ever wants to talk to him about it, and citing this as evidence of some sort of biased media conspiracy.
That's what he wrote in a long article in the current issue of Village magazine. Following which you quote in your, or which you reproduce in your article in Village magazine this month.
For weeks and weeks, I wrote a 7,000-word article in Village magazine, which dealt seriatim with every possible point. No journalist wrote about it. No radio programme asked me to appear, to discuss it. What does that say about democracy and media activity in this state? It's a very, very telling indictment that we actually have not journalists anymore. What we actually now have are activists with microphones, activists with laptops, not journalists.
So, yeah, that's a lie. Maybe he wasn't actually asked about the article that often because, as of the 11th of May 2020, an article which was written about 6 years prior only has just over 8,000 views. But, that's just a thought. Maybe not.
I was born on the Dublin street where the Lyle runs the beat, and the loving English feet that walked all over us. And every single night when me dad would come home tight, he'd invite the neighbours out with this chorus. Come out, ship-like and tans, come out and fight me like a man. Show your wife how you want.
Now, in preparation for this, I saved down all the articles I could find written by Waters, all the articles written about him, all the interviews I could find, TV and radio. But I actually hadn't saved this article, and I didn't even know about it until I heard Waters mentioning it at the end of the News Talk interview I played a clip from earlier. Because of the conspiracy. So I decided to have a read. I mean, it was a pretty comprehensive overview of things that had been written about him or said about him. But this was an overview of his opinion on things, so it doesn't really count. So let's have a quick look at this article and see what kind of things we're dealing with. So Waters starts this article off with a quote from Charles Piguet. I actually don't know. I don't know who this is. Here, hang on. I'll just quickly Google him here. Hang on. Let me just. P-E-G-U-Y. Piguet. There he is. French poet. Oh, Wikipedia, I suppose. Okay, let's see. National... Roman Catholic... Gnosticism, biography, influence. Benito Mussolini referred to PK as a source for fascism. Maybe we'll just move on. We'll ignore that. We'll just move on. I don't want to spend too much time in this article. Frankly, it's petty. There's nothing really of note within it. For example, at the beginning of the article, he mentions that when O'Neill said, quote, "What astounds me is there are people out there in the world who devote quite a large amount of their time and energy to try and stop people, achieving happiness, and that this is what people like the Iona Institute are at," end quote. That was actually wrong, because, according to Waters, he had only 3 or 4 days earlier, quote, declined an invitation from Vincent Brown tonight to talk about recent statement by former President Mary McAleese, end quote. Well, that puts it to bed, doesn't it? That's kind of the level of pettiness we're dealing with here. And it's this level of pettiness for almost 8,000 words. So I don't really want to go through it too much. Although there is this really amazing section where he talks about this Twitter profile, Thomas59, which has 5 followers and it's tweeting negative things about Waters. And so Waters gets his friend to do this kind of weird deep dive into the profile, really technical stuff. And he discovers that Thomas59, that profile, actually belongs to Patsy McGarry, who was the religious affairs correspondent in the Irish Times. And Waters makes this out to be a huge discovery, which took loads of work, but it actually wasn't a huge discovery because Patsy left the location services on, and a lot of the tweets came from either the area around Patsy's home address or the literal Irish Times building. And even better, the Twitter handle for Thomas59 was actually just Thomas, and then Patsy McGarry's actual phone number. The actual home phone number. It's amazing. It was beautiful. It made the whole thing worth it. Now, obviously, according to Waters, this is some sort of deep state conspiracy. And if you listen to the RT interview, which you really should, it's fantastic. The interviewer actually calls him out on this numerous times, and Waters sounds like an absolute fool. It's just great.
It was very traceable. The Twitter
It wasn't
account.
traceable.
What could be more traceable than putting his home phone number on it?
But it was by accident. I will tell. Okay, I'll tell you about this, Sean.
But he
hang on,
put it there.
It's very important. No, it's very important. He put it there, and then he thought that it couldn't be found. That's
But how could you not trace a home phone number? You probably recognised it yourself.
A home phone number. Who would recognise a home phone number?
I'm saying he left a trail that was very easily
he left a very
to track
stupid trail, yeah,
back to himself via his phone.
It wasn't. Let me tell you that it wasn't easy to track. It was a complete accident.
A phone number.
But it was a complete accident. I thought a phone number. Who would recognise a phone number?
All you have to do is check it out, dial it, and see what happens.
Well, dial it, yeah. But who uses phone numbers nowadays? That's an old phone number.
Well, I think it still is a phone number to his apartment. But anyway, look, we've probably talked.
But his name is not Thomas.
But the main reason why I bring up this Village article, apart from how hilariously paranoid it is the section Waters writes on the things he's written about homosexuality in the past. He specifically states in this Village article that he's never written about homosexuality because, he's not a homophobe. And he's using this article to try and evidence that. He says, quote, "I argue that there is a need to distinguish between the right of gay people to practice their sexuality and the issue of gay marriage. It's true, although liberal media persistently insinuate that opposition to gay marriage is homophobic, many gay men and women themselves oppose this development. For nearly a quarter of a century, I've written on average 2 articles per week, say 2,500 pieces in all. Yet in the search for evidence against me, all that could be unearthed were half a dozen half-phrases in an informal interview for which I was supposed to be sent quotes for approval but was not. And these phrases were deliberately manipulated and carefully removed from their context to the advantage of the undoubtedly colourful character. Surely if I were a vicious homophobe that the baying mob have labelled me, I would have used my columns over the years to campaign against homosexuality, gay marriage and the happiness of gay people like Rory O'Neill." End quote. Which, from what I could find while researching this video, is kind of true. John Waters didn't write many negative things about gay people. He mostly saved the awful stuff for when he's talking on panels or in interviews and things like that. Now, you might think that the quotes I mentioned earlier, the ones comparing same-sex couples to siblings or saying that gay marriage was satire, you might have thought that they were bad, and they were. They were awful. But he was able to weasel his way out of them by saying that people are too sensitive, or more frequently, that there's some sort of media conspiracy against him, the usual right-wing escape terms. But one of the most grotesque things which I actually came across in general, there's a few, we'll come to another one of them later, but one of the things came from a talk he did in 2016.
Now, paedophile priests, there's no such thing, or very little. This is the single most interesting lie about all this. They were not, 90% of the abusers in a Catholic Church were not paedophiles, they were ephebophiles, an entirely different phenomenon. They were abusers of teenage boys, which is closely aligned to homosexuality. You don't hear that on the BBC.
He then goes on to say that this is all some big worldwide media scandal, conspiracy, whatever it is. And it's not, John. It's absolutely not. People tend to disagree with the sexual abuse of minors in general, and unlike yourself, don't draw some absolutely ridiculous distinction between one form of child abuse and another form of child abuse simply because one of the children happens to hit their teens. Imagine, John, if you had a child, and for the subject matter of this video, it doesn't matter whether you do or not, hence why I've not mentioned it, but imagine you do, and they're sexually abused by someone when they're 13 or 14. Are you going to correct people if they call that abuser a paedophile? Are you going to say, oh, actually no, that person's an ephebophile, bollocks you are? And again, I want to point out that this man has said he's not homophobic, even though he's explicitly just said that the abuse of teenage boys was closely aligned to homosexuality. So not only is he lessening the crimes of child abuse by the clergy, he's lessening the crimes of child abuse in general by saying that there's some sort of rankings of awfulness based on the age of, and I cannot stress this word enough, the child that's being abused. And then he pivots on this point to make some sort of straw man out of the very group he claims to have no problem with. And I know I don't need to prove him wrong, but I'm going to anyway. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, whose charter Waters actually used as the basis for his opposition to the marriage referendum, set up a committee called Child Rights International Network in 2014. In 2019, they released the preliminary findings of a study they titled Child Sexual Abuse and the Holy See: The Need for Justice, Accountability and Reform. This study found that in the United States, 22.6% of the victims were aged 10 or younger, 51% were between the ages of 11 and 14, while 27% were aged 15 to 17. Now, there aren't stats for some other countries because the church tried to cover it up, even suing in some countries to prevent the statistics from being made public, like in Ireland. So I don't really know where your 90% came from, John. And not only are your percentages wrong, I'm not even going to do the maths for you. The percentages don't matter, because they're goddamn children. You absolute monster. Okay, I've gone through many of the ways in which Waters has spoken about same-sex couples and gay people in general, and it's starting to hurt my soul. So I'd like to talk about something else before I cry. So if you could briefly cast your mind back to the whole Pantygate situation, John was under quite a bit of scrutiny during this time. In the public sphere, it was because he was called a homophobe, and in the media, it was due to the perceived attempt by John to prevent free speech because of the libel lawsuit. So it's understandable and, let's be honest, expected that during the interview with The Independent, he'd be asked about his mental health over this period, and his response was something else. Quote, asked if he had become depressed as a result of the national backlash, he said, I don't believe in depression. There's no such thing. It's an invention. It's bullshit, he said. It's a cop-out. End quote. Now, I don't think I really need to talk about how wrong these comments are. Of course John thinks it's not a big deal. No, there's a far more scandalous force at work, and that is corrupt media. Of course it is. Here's what he said when he was asked about these on the RTE radio interview that we mentioned earlier.
You, again, were criticised, I have to say, admittedly, on Twitter quite extensively, where you said to the Sunday Independent last week, I don't believe in depression, there's no such thing, it's an invention, it's bullshit, it's a cop-out.
Well, this was an answer which had nothing to do with the subject. This question, I was repeatedly asked by the journalist, are you suicidal? Are you depressed? And I responded impatiently to that in the way that you've cited there. But I find it extraordinary that on the foot of that single response, which is to do a personal response to an invasive question, that I have received telephone calls from radio stations all over this island, from the BBC, from Cork, from everywhere, And yet I have written countless articles over 24 years in the Irish Times about suicide, about the high preponderance of male suicides, about all kinds of issues, and I've had received no phone calls at all from any of these radio stations.
And again, he's kind of right here. I mean, he has written about depression and suicide many times. Interestingly, only male depression, but that's besides the point. And I'm not going to sit here and say that he didn't mean or believe what he wrote in those articles, because he said himself that he thinks that depression is bullshit, and that means that I don't actually have to say that. I mean, maybe you were receiving phone calls about these comments because of the hypocrisy, John. I mean, for example, if I were to post numerous YouTube videos about how I'm an ally of the LGBTQIA plus community, and I am, so I probably will, that's not really that big a deal, because in saying these things, I'm gathering a particular audience who'd agree with my viewpoints, but they'd also understand that I'd be available to stand with them to try and right some of the wrongs which are inevitable in society. If I was then spotted saying something extremely homophobic, like same-sex marriage is a satire, for example, people would rightly have questions, because I would have built an audience based on the public perception I created, and the public perception would have been based on my previous words and actions. So for you to complain about why you're getting calls about this and not about your articles is just wrong. I mean, your articles and your complete contradiction of what you've written in those articles now don't hold the same weight anymore. I mean, maybe you didn't get calls because they actually wanted to talk to medical experts about depression. Or maybe it's because your articles aren't actually as profound as you thought they were. Okay, you made it to the end of that section. Well done. I'm absolutely exhausted. In the next section, we're going to be touching on a few topics, but we're mostly going to be talking about the campaign to repeal the Eighth Amendment. But don't worry, John was far more calm when it came to that. Didn't really say anything too out there. In fact, he was actually quite... Oh, for fuck... Hi again, everyone. I'm recording this after I've actually gone through and done all the editing for the video. And I'm realising that this next section is actually quite difficult to listen to. The topics are mostly abortion and miscarriage. There's quite a few references to that. So if you don't feel comfortable listening to those kind of topics, I've popped a timestamp on screen. You can skip to what I suppose I'll call the conclusion of the video. I will be referring to all sections of the video in the conclusion, but I've kind of written in a broad way, so it's only slight callbacks, so you'll still understand what I'm talking about. I would encourage you to watch this section if you can. I think it's important to know and to understand the events which both led to and happened during the campaign for the 36th Amendment, or the repeal of the 8th Amendment as it's more commonly known. So yeah, that's all. Thanks. On Sunday the 21st of October 2012 at about 9:30 a.m, a woman was examined at University Hospital Galway complaining of lower back pain. She was accompanied by her husband during this exam. The woman was about 17 weeks pregnant with her first child. The patient, having a history of lower back pain, was advised to rest, although if there were any further concerns or if the pain increased, they could come back to the hospital, and the hospital would prescribe paracetamol, which is a common painkiller. Sunday the 21st of October 2012, 3:30 p.m. The patient returned to the hospital, upset and crying. She said that she had felt something was coming down. The midwife on call stated, quote, "I immediately thought she would miscarry and brought her for an examination," end quote. Sunday the 21st of October 2012 at about 4:20 p.m. The patient describes the lower back pain as different to any other pain she'd experienced previously. It had been present for about 24 hours and was currently unbearable. The patient was also experiencing crampy abdominal pains. Sunday the 21st of October 2012, sometime prior to 5 p.m. The patient is admitted to a single room in the gynecology ward in the hospital. Monday the 22nd of October 2012, at about 12:30 a.m. The patient vomits a significant amount and has a SROM, a spontaneous rupture of the membranes, meaning that the membranes around the fetus had burst and the fluid had leaked out. The midwife on call stated that the patient's pyjamas were wet and there was a pool of clear fluid around her feet. The patient was escorted back to bed, indicated that she was feeling better, and had no complaints of pain at that time. Monday the 22nd of October, 8:20 a.m. The patient is examined by the consulting OBGYN and is told that, quote, it was unlikely that she would continue on to a time of fetal viability, end quote. Tuesday the 23rd of October 2012, just before 8:30 a.m. The patient and her husband were told by the consulting physician that miscarriage was inevitable. According to the medical report, quote, the consultant stated that the patient and her husband inquired about the possibility of using medication to induce miscarriage, as they indicated they did not want a protracted waiting time when the outcome of miscarriage was inevitable, end quote. The consulting physician responded, quote, under Irish law, if there is no evidence of risk to the life of the mother, our hands are tied so long as there's a fetal heartbeat, end quote. On Wednesday the 24th of October 2012, at about 7 a.m, the patient complained of a fever which was measured at 39.6 degrees, as well as weakness, chills and rigour, which is the medical term for the low-level shakes you get when you're cold. Wednesday the 24th of October 2012 at 7:20 a.m, the patient vomits green bile. Wednesday the 24th of October 2012, 1:20 p.m. A review of the patient is performed and a diagnosis of septic shock is made, most likely due to chorioamnionitis. The patient's condition continues to decline. Wednesday the 24th of October 2012, 3 p.m. An ultrasound is carried out indicating that there is no longer a fetal heartbeat. The patient is scheduled for immediate surgery to induce miscarriage. Wednesday the 24th of October, 3:15 p.m. The patient is transferred to the operating theatre. While there, she suffers a spontaneous miscarriage. And while the patient is now alert and responsive, her vital signs continue to decline. Low respiratory and heart rate continues, with an elevating fever. Thursday the 25th of October, 2012, 3 a.m. The patient is transferred to the intensive care unit. Sunday the 28th of October, at 1:09 a.m. The patient, Savita Halapanavar, dies of a cardiac arrest which was brought on by septicemia. She was 31. Now, there have been numerous examples of Ireland's mistreatment of women in our history, particularly but not exclusively when it comes to pregnancy and childbearing, from the complete lack of treatment of women in the laundries to the X case, which we'll discuss later. All of these incidents have had an impact on Irish society as a whole, either by sympathetic showings of support or, more often, a hardening of the walls of Catholic ideology. But I don't think anything had the same heart-wrenching impact as the death of Savita did. There was a tangible feeling of anger and sadness in the country. This was regardless of your stance on abortion in the immediate aftermath. Everything, to be honest, just kind of felt shit. I mean, I'm speaking from my own point of view here, so feel free to correct me if I'm applying my own current feelings about it to my memories, but there was a genuine wave of like, Jesus, this is terrible. Everywhere. And it started to raise real questions on whether the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, which put the rights of the unborn over all else, including the life of the mother, was fit for purpose. Sadly, the death of Savita wouldn't be the last time there was an extremely questionable decision made based on this law. There's also the case of Mrs. P, a woman who, in 2014, while about 12 or 14 weeks pregnant, fell and was found unresponsive. She's declared clinically brain dead by her doctors, and her husband is told that she's going to be kept on life support until the fetus becomes viable and can be delivered. Like this actually happened in Ireland just 6 years ago, 2 years after the death of Savita. The only reason the woman was taken off life support after over 20 days was because the judge said there was no prospect of her baby actually being born alive. All this could have been prevented by taking action on a decision made on an incident which occurred in the very early 90s. This incident centred on a 14-year-old girl who was raped by her neighbour and became pregnant in 1991. It came to be known as the X case, and it's probably one of the most famous cases in Irish law. Now, this girl was a ward of the state, or ward of the court as the term is commonly used in Ireland. And for those who don't know, a person under the age of 18 can be a ward of court for numerous reasons. They don't necessarily need to lack the capacity to make a decision. And again, there are numerous problems with the ward of court system in Ireland, but now's not the time to get into it. This 14-year-old girl told her mother that she was having suicidal thoughts because of this unwanted pregnancy. And the family agreed to travel with her to have an abortion, due to the fact that abortion was completely illegal on the whole island of Ireland. Prior to travelling, the mother, knowing that this was a rape case, and with the neighbour denying any involvement, asked the Gardaí, the Irish police, if DNA from an aborted fetus could be admissible as evidence in court. On hearing this, the Attorney General, a man called Harry Wheelahan, decided to intervene. He prevented the 14-year-old from travelling in order to protect the Eighth Amendment. Now, this decision got appealed and eventually found its way to the Supreme Court, where it was overturned, but the damage had already been done. The 14-year-old, and I know I keep saying that, but that's the most extraordinary thing about this, the child miscarried prior to undertaking the abortion. As Supreme Court Justice Hugh O'Flaherty said after the X case, quote, "The stark situation is, if someone who is pregnant commits suicide, you lose the mother and the child." End quote. This led to numerous changes in the Constitution, all as per usual by public vote. There were actually 3 separate referenda on the same day in 1992, November 25th. The 12th Amendment, which was a prohibition on abortion even in cases where the pregnant woman was suicidal. The 13th Amendment, the prohibition of abortion could not prevent a woman from travelling outside of the state to have an abortion. And the 14th Amendment, which said that a prohibition of abortion could not limit the right to distribute information about abortion services in foreign countries. On that day, the 13th and 14th Amendments were passed, but the 12th was rejected, showing that even in the early 90s, people still understood the inhumanity of this law. Side note, the exact same proposal for the 12th Amendment was actually put forward again 10 years later in 2012, and it was rejected for a second time. Okay, so the 12th Amendment was rejected. The Supreme Court made a ruling, so it's all sorted, right? No, of course not. That's not how things work here. While the Supreme Court ruled on this in 1992, it would be a long time before this ruling was actually put in place. It was eventually brought in as part of what's known as the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act 2013. This act meant that if a pregnancy was a threat to the life of the mother, including through the risk of suicide, then an abortion could be performed. Now, I want to point out that the 2013 at the end of that act, it isn't like a case number or an act number or anything like that. That's the year it came into effect. From the date of the Supreme Court ruling in the X case to the date it was actually enacted, July 12, 2013, 7,799 days had passed. It's 21 years. And 7,535 days after the ruling was made by the Supreme Court. On Sunday the 21st of October 2012 at about 9:30 a.m, a woman was examined at University Hospital Galway, complaining of lower back pain. Now, from the outset, I'll say that John Waters is fully opposed to abortion. He believes that a fetus is a human being who is alive as you or I, it just hasn't been born yet. Now, even though you might assume I would, I'm not actually going to comment on this particular line of thought because I know and care deeply about numerous people who have this belief, and I firmly disagree with them, but I'm happy enough to let them have this, so it would be hypocritical if I were to make fun of John Waters for this. But there is plenty more to actually comment on. What I will comment on is the very calm and collected way John Waters spoke throughout the campaign. He was extremely composed, weren't you, John?
You're a fucking bollocks!
Okay then. John tried to stay out of Irish media as much as possible throughout this campaign, really only showing up to do interviews with people he calls friends, like that clip we heard there, which is from The Last Stand with Eamon Dunphy, or when he was going on a show presented by a woman, so he'd feel more comfortable yelling at the interviewer, I guess. And that interview with Eamon Dunphy is actually a really perfect example of how Waters deals with people who push back against his viewpoints, even in the smallest way. Dunphy starts this interview by saying that he's an undecided no voter. He thinks he's going to vote to keep the Eighth Amendment in the Constitution, but he's not entirely sure. And that's a valid point for an interviewer to take. I'd say a good one. I mean, he can ask the question he wants to, but he can also ask the questions that the yes side might put forward, without seeming like he's on the attack. At least that would be the case if John Waters wasn't such a big baby. Dunphy raises an extremely valid question about the morning after pill. If, as Dunphy asks, life begins at conception, then how does one view the taking of the morning after pill? Now, John obviously doesn't like this line of questioning because he can't put forward his viewpoint. Waters responds to that question from Dunphy by saying, quote, "We're not talking about abortion pills, we're talking about wholesale slaughter, potentially up to the moment of birth, and possibly even past it." End quote. Okay, well, the first thing to mention here is obviously the term possibly even past it. I mean, this is outrageous. John's pivoted from the question of when do you think life begins to the argument that repealing the eighth could give... Oh, God, okay. John's pivoted from the question of when do you think life begins, which is a very straightforward question, to the argument that repealing the Eighth Amendment could give legal precedent to end the life of any human being at any time. It's absolutely incredible. But this is the kind of language he uses throughout the campaign. Whenever the questions are put to him, a man who's classed as an intellectual, by the way, he either ignores the point or becomes aggressive. But let's continue on with this Dunphy interview. Dunphy really wants to understand when life begins. And let's not forget, he is an undecided no voter. John is talking to the very person that any campaigner dreams of talking to. Someone who's on your side and basically just needs a little push in the right direction. So Dunphy asks the same question in a different way. If a woman has a one-night stand and takes the morning after pill, has she had an abortion? Waters responds, quote, what we're talking about here is not the philosophical question of when life begins or whatever, end quote. But John, that is a vital piece of information which people need to understand if they're going to tackle a question like this. And it's not even a philosophical question, because 8 days after this interview, people would basically be voting on their interpretation of this exact question. It's a fundamental question to understand because if you're against abortion because it takes a life, but you don't believe that life begins at conception, then there's absolutely no reason for you to oppose legislation which would legalise abortion up to that point, whatever that is for you. By the way, if you disagree with that statement that I just made, then maybe you should look a bit deeper into your own reasons for being against abortion in the first place. They might quite not be as straightforward as you think. Waters goes on to say in the same answer, quote, this is typical of the kind of media attempt to turn this into something else, to talk about hard cases, to make fudgy philosophical arguments which will delay and frustrate and confuse the people about something that is so clear, end quote. Now, John, this is wrong, and I feel as though I've been saying that an awful lot today. You can't just ignore the hard cases. The hard cases and the exceptions are precisely what should be getting looked at in this case. Like, if you're an architect, you can't just claim that people are trying to cause a fuss after they look at your design and they ask why there are no fire exits. Also, I want to point out that John Waters has completely argued against his own reasons for fighting against same-sex marriage a few years prior as well. His entire argument during that campaign was that, well, first of all, he wasn't a homophobe, but also that people weren't looking at the legislation correctly and weren't asking the hard questions about what the outcome of that vote might be. So, which is it? So I'm going to play 2 clips here. One, just to show how calm Eamon Dunphy is as an interviewer. So this wasn't a hard-hitting, Piers Morgan screaming at you type of encounter. This was a calm man asking calm questions. And this clip will actually start at the end of the previous quote that I just read out from John Waters, just to clarify.
We are talking here about whether or not we want to walk into a polling booth, pick up a pencil, put on a black cap and condemn hundreds of thousands of children to death for the rest of your life. Every day, every day, every day. That's the question.
But fundamental to that is a shared or an agreement as to when life.
Well, I've answered that question. I've said it begins at conception.
Please, let me just tease it out with you.
Now, there's no real content in that clip. I mainly played it just to show that Waters really isn't under any pressure. It's a very calm discussion. Well, on one side of the table, anyway. I mainly just wanted to show you how little confrontation was happening, so you'd understand how mental the reaction in the next clip is.
When people talk about people buying abortion pills on the internet,
this is not about abortion pills.
No, I know, but I'm saying that's one
we
thing.
have 40 minutes to do an interview to do about this. So can we talk about the issue, or else I'm going home? I'm fed up with this. Listen,
I don't go.
No, you told me this will be a fair interview.
It will be.
It's not a fair interview.
I'm on the same.
You're a fucking bollocks. Get fuck off here now. You told me yesterday that you wanted to support. You wanted to talk.
I'm a no voter.
Talk to him, Manali. Fuck off.
John Waters, ladies and gentlemen. Dignified debater. But okay, maybe I'm being too harsh here. I mean, Lord knows, I've probably lashed out at a friend of mine who was asking me questions on something we both agree with and then called him a fucking bollocks, went to leave the room and then came back to say that it wasn't fair because he was supposed to agree with me and then told him to fuck off again. I mean, who hasn't done that? And this is the way Waters behaved pretty much throughout the campaign. He was rude and he was belligerent. From a man who said that Liberals refused to debate in the marriage referendum, he's not really leading by example. Waters did most of the discussion on this referendum online, in articles and opinion pieces, mostly for the previously mentioned First Things. You remember them, the group that said they'd no problem with Ronald Reagan calling black people monkeys? Yeah, those. One such piece is titled Ireland's Constitutional Crisis. In this he talks about how, for nearly 6 years, he's been involved in a continuous political battle to preserve particular understandings of the law. He says there are certain rights which are fundamental and non-negotiable. These include certain personal rights on which depend the security and freedoms of the individual, except for freedom of speech, I suppose, eh, John? Family rights, which is protecting the unity and cohesion of the most fundamental group of society, and collective rights, regulating the health and stability of the nation. Now, this article is largely about the abortion referendum, so you already know where he's going with this. He continues trying to push this extremely hypothetical argument that we're on some sort of horrendous slippery slope. Quote, if it is possible for the Irish people to adjudicate by ballot on this question, why might we not in the future deliberate similarly on the right to life of the elderly, the homeless, the travellers, or the mentally ill? What might ensure that such possibilities continue to seem absurd? End quote. I mean, this quote really shows just how little he actually understands the point. And seeing as how he'd probably tell us to fuck off if we asked him when he thinks life begins, there isn't really a point in delving into this article too much. I mean, to be honest, that quote sums up the entire article. I mean, there's nothing in there which hasn't really been mentioned already. What? God damn it, John, I've already done this, please. So let's take a look at another article he's written. Here's one about U2, about how U2 has betrayed rock and roll. Now, this is mostly about how members of the Irish band U2 came out in favour of repealing the Eighth. In reality, it's actually just another piece that John writes about how everyone who disagrees with him is wrong. Quote, only those deluded by hypnotic propaganda and those who do not care about the consequences can really truly buy in. End quote. He states in this piece that his problem with U2 coming out in support of repealing the Eighth, quote, is not so much with some offence against their once shameless Christianity. U2's real offence is a betrayal of the very roots of the music itself. End quote. The music here meaning rock and roll. And you're probably wondering what that means. And I was wondering what it meant. And I thought to myself, the roots of rock and roll, what could that mean? And then a wave of horror washed over me as I thought, no, he's not going to say what I think he's going to say. John then goes on to write, quote, the blues were born in the plantations where slaves in chains worked themselves unto early deaths, hollering out to their brothers over each other's heads on the line, their cries becoming chants forming songs, unleashing a music that nobody could have imagined or predicted. End quote. He's gonna do it, isn't he? What do you think he's going to say? I'm not going to lie, he's actually going to say it. Quote, to say that abortion is the slavery of the present is more than rhetoric, because each of the two in its own way involves the purchasing of the convenience of one with the life of another. End quote. Okay, so again, this is wrong on numerous levels. Slavery has existed in many forms throughout history, and it still does exist in many forms, including in many very subtle forms. But to use the comparison that John is making, I'm going to talk about slavery in the US. And first of all, believe it or not, every single person was a fetus at some point. That obviously changes when you're born and grow and yada yada, you know how that works. Well, I hope you do anyway. So, while being a fetus is both common to everybody and temporary, and I can't believe I actually have to explain this to John, slavery was generally permanent and specific to a certain group of people. And of course, this being written in First Thing, they probably don't want to mention what race those certain group of people were. Also, I'm very disappointed to see that there's nothing in this article at all about U2 automatically uploading their songs or their whole album to every iPod. Do you remember that? That was mad. Like that's the real betrayal right there. That's the real betrayal of rock and roll. Now, finally, I want to mention the screenshot I showed at the end of part 2 of the video. This one. Waters was asked about this in an interview on The Sunday Show on TV3 with Sarah McInerney. And not at all relevant to anything, but Sarah McInerney actually now presents the RTE show that was hosted by Sean O'Rourke, which was the RTE show we played a clip from earlier on. I say earlier on, it's probably about like 6 hours ago now, but yeah, just thought that was kind of funny. When the question is raised by McInerney about whether Waters actually said this or not, Waters immediately shuts it down in a very matter-of-fact way. He just, no, I didn't. That's all he says. And that's case closed. We're ready to move on. McInerney is ready to move on. She does that usual journalist thing of repeating the question, but in a negative way. So where she'd originally asked, it's been quoted that you compared yada yada. John Waters says no. She then says, okay, so you didn't say yada yada. John Waters decides to then jump in and explain how what he said wasn't comparing abortion to the Holocaust. But in doing so, he proves that what he said was comparing abortion to the Holocaust.
You compared the abortion or the introduction of abortion in this country to the Holocaust recently enough, I think. You didn't? Okay. It was reported in the Irish Central newspaper.
The Irish Central is an appalling rag.
That's not true. Okay, that's fine, sorry, that's fine. Good to clarify.
I made an entirely, I can explain you the point I was making. I was talking about what happens when natural rights get struck down. And that was the connection in which I talked about the experience in Nazi Germany. That was one of the things, that Jewish people's rights were struck down by statutory instrument. Here, it's different. We've been invited to strike down rights by referendum, which is actually in many ways worse.
All right.
Worse than the Holocaust? And I was sitting over my keyboard for, I'd say, a good solid 20-30 minutes trying to think of some clever comment to say here or some way to bat this down, but I'm actually not going to, because anything I say would probably somehow make that comment less awful. So, John Waters has spoken out against civil partnership, same-sex marriage, an amendment to the abortion referendums. He said that depression was made up and compared abortion to Holocaust and slavery. So is he out of touch? No, it's the public who are wrong. Fucking love The Simpsons. And I know you're screaming, when will this end? Please. And it will end soon, and I'm proud of you for making it this far. So since the repeal the 8th referendum, John Waters has taken a disliking to the classic right-wing straw man. Immigrants. You know, immigrants coming over here, being Irish, helping the economy, being good people. Mary Kenny wrote a glowing piece about Waters in the Irish Catholic, surprise, surprise, a Catholic newspaper, in January of this year, 2020. Mary commended Waters for his stances on abortion and same-sex marriage, as one would expect for a writer in the Irish Catholic. And I'm not having a go at Mary here. I mean, she outlines her views on this. I disagree with them. And she's essentially commending someone else for speaking out in favour of those views. I'm going to give Mary the benefit of the doubt and assume that she doesn't know most of the things that I've mentioned in this video. Towards the end of the article, she says this, quote, I would, as a friend, caution John against rhetoric on mass migration. There hasn't been mass migration into Ireland, and most migrants I've encountered have been welcomed and integrated well. I hope Dún Laoghaire shows support for his courage, patriotism, and originality. End quote. That's right, folks. John Waters decided to put his money where his mouth was and run for government. He ran in Dún Laoghaire, which is where he's lived for the last 30 years or so, and that's very worrying, I hear you say. I don't hear you say that at all, but even so, very worrying after the enormous impact his words and actions had in the last few referendum. He surely must have gotten a healthy... I can't even do this line. Okay. He surely must have gotten in with an extremely healthy number of votes. Well, first, let's have a look at the platform he ran on. He uploaded a video to social media where he talked about the big issues he felt needed to be addressed. Well, I'd say issues, plural. There was one issue, basically, and it was the foreigners.
Why is this topic of mass immigration not being discussed in this election? How can we have what is called a leaders' debate when it is never mentioned? Why is it not in any of the newspapers? Why is it not in any of the political literature? This is perhaps the greatest crisis facing us at this moment, where the absolute configuration of our society, the demography, the culture, is being changed before our eyes, without our permission, without consulting with us. And we're not allowed to speak about it. We are bullied and intimidated into silence if we raise even a question about what has happened. If we ask, where is this leading us? How many people are we expected to take? What will be the benefit? What will be the consequences? What will be the bad consequences? Can we discuss the possibilities, the potentialities? No, they say. No, if you do so, you are a racist. These are the only arguments they can come up with. While meanwhile, people are terrified that their country is being stolen out from under them, that their country is being destroyed, that their very home, the home of their own children and their children's children, is being taken away. Because whereas the people who come here as workers, as whatever, asylum seekers, they will in the end have homes to return to. This is our home. What will happen to it? Can we even ask the question? We need to ask the question right now. Election 2020 may be the last chance to have this conversation.
So what you heard and saw there was John Waters spouting off the usual rhetoric that anti-immigration campaigners have. I think it would be a good idea to go through each of those points, because these are the classic arguments, the kind of points that are made that don't really have a point, but seem very profound.
Why is this topic of mass immigration not being discussed in this election? How can we have what is called a leaders' debate when it is never mentioned? Why is it not in any of the newspapers? Why is it not in any of the political literature?
So I'm just going to take these first few lines as 5 separate questions, and I'm being generous with 5. I mean, it's really 4, but that doesn't matter. They're wrong anyway. I'm just going to go ahead and pop a graphic on screen. These are the reasons that people gave for why they voted in the most recent election. As you can see, immigration was not an issue at all. So that's all 5 of those questions answered. Nobody cared about it, John. That's why no one's talking about it.
This is perhaps the greatest crisis facing us at this moment, where the absolute configuration of our society, the demography, the culture, is being changed before our eyes.
So some very big points being made by John here. The configuration of our society, the demography, the culture is all being changed. But according to the last census, immigration has actually gone down. Unless you want to count the Irish who have been living abroad, in which case it has gone up. But I can't imagine that John's complaining about the Irish coming back, or maybe he is. I don't know.
Without our permission, without consulting with us.
Alright, this one. John, we're an island. People are coming in by plane or by boat. Like, they're not sneaking in. They're not tunneling in through Drogheda. I mean, I don't get what your argument is here. They're coming in plain sight.
And we're not allowed to speak about it. We are bullied and intimidated into silence if we raise even a question about what has happened.
This one is my favourite, though. I mean, this is my absolute favourite argument that everyone on the right is making these days. That people are being bullied and intimidated into silence, that people are being censored. And again, I want to remind you that this is a video that John publicly posted online. And also, I really want to stress this part. This video outlines his platform for running for government. He's not being silenced at all. He is able to run for national office using this as a platform.
If we ask, where is this leading us? How many people are we expected to take? What will be the benefit? What will be the consequences? What will be the bad consequences? Can we discuss the possibilities, the potentialities? No, they say. No, if you do so, you are a racist. These are the only arguments they can come up with.
Okay. What John is doing here is asking impossible questions. Philosophical questions, which I know John hates. I mean, I could just as easily sit here and ask, if John Waters got elected, where's this leading us? How many people are going to get hurt if we elect him? Who will benefit? What will be the consequences? What will be the bad consequences? Will we get a complimentary breakfast? This isn't an argument. These are just generic questions which can't be answered without an actual context. I mean, I've already shown that every point you've made so far in this video is wrong. People are making the arguments against you. You're just ignoring them. You're not listening because you don't want to listen. Also, who is they? They say you are a racist. No, they say. Who is that?
While meanwhile, people are terrified that their country is being stolen out from under them, that their country is being destroyed, that their very home, the home of their own children and their children's children, is being taken away.
So there's barely any accurate way to survey the emotional feelings of an individual, let alone an entire nation. So there's no real way you can argue against this point, unless you were to look at the Census of the Heart conducted by the Trailblazery in 2016. This was a series of questions put to just under 12,000 people living in Ireland. Question 27 of this survey was, most of the time I feel, and then you could either tick 3 boxes or you could insert your own answers. As you can see on this graphic, very few people actually said they were scared. Although interestingly, the largest number who said they were scared are those individuals who didn't identify as either male or female, which is probably something we're going to look at in a different video. Sadly, that number isn't really surprising in terms of the way that transgender and non-binary people are spoken about in our culture. But again, this is a survey on emotions. It's not scientific. Neither is John's point. It's just wrong. It's not factual. It's just a talking point.
Because whereas the people who come here as workers, as whatever, asylum seekers, they will in the end have homes to return to.
John, most of these people will go home to Cork or Dublin or Galway. Or maybe they'll go to the country that they originally came from. Maybe they might want to. I mean, I don't want to take the easy option here in terms of arguing against this point, but there's always an extraordinary double standard when an Irish person complains about immigration or emigration. I mean, to be honest, I'm more worried about the number of Irish people who could return to this island after Brexit than I am about a couple of hundred lads coming in from Nigeria. 10% of the UK either have or are eligible for an Irish passport. That's a lot of people. But I suppose they're alright, John, aren't they? I mean, you don't have any problem with the Irish people coming back. I wonder why.
This is our home. What will happen to it? Can we even ask the question? We need to ask the question right now. Election 2020 may be the last chance to have this conversation.
Okay, this is starting to hurt me now. I'll just go through these in order. It's their home too. Nothing will happen to it. The island is pretty sturdy. I don't think the island is going anywhere, John. You literally just asked that question on a video you were free to post online for all to see. So yes, you can ask the question. Done. Thank you. Okay, so they're the very well thought out and very meticulously researched points that John made as his platform for running for government. Let's see how he did. So Dún Laoghaire had just shy of 100,000 people on the register. Just over 62,500 people voted. It's not a bad turnout. Let's see, how many votes did John get? Weird. I'm looking at the top here and I can't see. Oh, no, there he is at the bottom. 925 votes. Second only to a party of actual literal Nazis. Another resounding victory for John Waters. Well done, mate. Okay, so before we finish up, I'd like to do, I was going to say a short conclusion, but nothing about this video is short, so I want to point to a few things which I think really describe the mentality that John Waters has about the world. And again, I want to make clear that this is my opinion on this. Don't read between the lines here because I'm not trying to say anything that I'm not actually saying. So do you remember earlier on in the video, 12 hours ago, when I sarcastically said that John Waters has never actually been wrong about anything, and then I put up screenshots of the articles he wrote to contradict myself for comedic effect, and then you didn't laugh? Yeah, well, these are articles that he's written in which the arguments he puts forward are objectively wrong. And I've read through a lot of his articles while researching for this video, and there are things he's written which I agree with to varying degrees. For example, he wrote one article in the Irish Times titled, "Why the Newspaper Has a Future in the Digital Age." This article's about how he got a younger person he knows a subscription to the Irish Times, convinced that they'd only read the electronic version on their phone or on the computer, and how he was pleasantly surprised when they only wanted to read the actual physical paper because it felt more important. It felt like the information was getting absorbed better. He then goes on to talk about the respect which younger generations have for books and newspapers and vinyl, and that shows how there's still a place for physical newspapers going forwards. Which I think is a valid point. It's a bit anecdotal, but it's an opinion piece, so that's fine, but it's not wrong. Another article talks about how the boomer generation split around the time of Woodstock into kind of like two separate movements. One side seeing Woodstock and the free love movement of the 60s as perfect examples of like excess and laziness and hedonism, and the other side seeing it as freedom and liberation and a drive towards equality. He said that this mentality has been passed down through generations, and that current younger generations have taken this, and for God's sake. Okay, well, I agree with the newspaper one anyway. That's one at least. But while reading through all these articles, I came across this one, which, I mean, look at the headline. How could I not click on it? And when I started reading, I realised that I actually remember this case. Now, I did have to read up on it again to refresh my memory for this video, but it was basically an Irish businessman who was sentenced to 6.5 or 7 years in prison for the avoidance of import tax, because he said that he was shipping in 1,000 tons of apples, which have a low rate of import tax, but he was actually shipping in 1,000 tons of garlic, which have a very high rate of import tax. John thought that this law was absurd. He thought that it was a ridiculous law which was being enforced by lobby groups, and I'm sure he'd be very upset with that idea when he realises that all that garlic was going to be used in food at gay weddings. I have it on good authority that gays love garlic. That's also not true. I don't have that on good authority at all. I have no authority. Hashtag garlic for gays. Towards the end of the piece, though, he wrote this, quote, "But as the Russian-American author and philosopher Ayn Rand pointed out in 1957, there is another syndrome here that we need to be conscious of also. Subquote, there is no way, she said, to rule innocent men. The only power government has is the power to crack down on criminals. Well, when there aren't enough criminals, one makes them. One declares so many things to be a crime that it becomes impossible for men to live without breaking laws. End subquote, end quote." And as I was reading this, the only thing that was playing in my mind was actually a back and forth from the RTE interview that I played a bit of earlier. In this exchange, he's talking about how many pieces were written in newspapers and magazines and things like that, specifically about him during the Pantygate scandal, I guess is what we'll call it. He says that they were consistently being written about him. He mentions an editorial which was written which suggested that people who opposed gay marriage might be homophobic, and he was convinced that it's actually about him.
It was an editorial in which it was suggested that it is that people who are opposed to gay marriage may well indeed be homophobic. Now, that's the entitled.
But you are not opposed to gay marriage. You just said that, so therefore it wasn't referring to you.
They didn't admit that.
But
they didn't publish
were you
that.
named in the article?
They didn't publish. Well, of course, people knew who they were talking about because this allegation had been made.
But maybe you were drawing things to yourself or onto yourself that don't actually necessarily apply.
Well, who did they apply to?
People who are opposed to gay marriage.
My final opinion on John Waters is that he thinks that any opposition to the things that he says or does are not because he's wrong or because people may disagree with him, but because he is a target. He is being made a criminal by the liberal ideology of the government, and the people who oppose him are blindly following the government and are nothing more than unpaid enforcers or sheep. Anyone who writes something he disagrees with is writing about him. Anyone who thinks that he's wrong doesn't think so because they have their own viewpoint, but because they have none. They are ill-informed and part of some agenda or lobby. Having gone through all this, I wouldn't call John homophobic. I wouldn't call John paranoid. I wouldn't call John red-pilled or neoconservative or xenophobic. But he certainly says things that are. Hi everybody, so thanks for watching. I appreciate you sitting through the whole thing. It got a little bit the script writing got a bit out of hand. I had originally planned this to be, 15-20 minutes long, and then I started writing and couldn't stop writing. I'd like to apologise for any maybe poor editing or poor audio production or just my voice in general. I know I've had a lot of vocal frying. I've been quite ill, but I wanted to get this done. Oh, maybe I had COVID. Did I? No, I couldn't have. So yeah, leave any comments that you have on the video down below. I'd like to hear from you. If you have any suggestions for videos for me to do in the future, I would like to keep doing this. As painful as it was to get through everything, I did really enjoy it. What's the YouTube thing? Like, share, subscribe, etc., all that kind of stuff. Twitter, at Paul the Robin. I think that's it. Oh, actually, support trans charities and support LGBTQIA+ charities as well. Okay, yeah, we're good. Okay, thank you.